it literally was an instant decision, and I did have a mortgage to pay, and I didn't have a big pot of money in the bank because I'd been living the lifestyle as you do, but it was a decision that was made on the basis that if I carried on doing what I was doing, I probably wouldn't be alive today.
If you lead an interesting life, good pictures will happen.
Oh, nice. You might well be my sexiest sounding guest.
Go somewhere you've never been before and take a camera.
We had this gorgeous Mediterranean light just flowing in.
Which Asda were you in?
Dartford.
Very nice.
Your first 10,000 pictures of your worst.
Let's sit down, let's have a cup of tea.
Welcome to the show. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to another episode of the Standout Photography Show with me, Matthew Walker, where, as always, it is my honour and privilege to interview the finest working photographers in the world to unpack their systems, workflows, and find out what enables them to perform consistently at the very top of their profession. Before I introduce our guest today, would you like to maximise your photography in one short email? Like you, my goal is to improve. So, every Friday you can receive a handful of bullet points highlighting things I've discovered from speaking with the best photographers in the world. It could be software recommendations, articles, book quotes, videos we've shared. All are designed to challenge you, expand your photography knowledge, and keep you ahead of the competition. It has become extremely popular since we started this podcast. It's completely free, very short, won't clog up your inbox, but could make a big difference to your photography. If you'd like to receive that, head on over to thestandoutcompany.com/podcast. That is thestandoutcompany.com/podcast. Drop in your email and you'll receive the very next issue. Similarly, this show is all about you. Is there a world-class photographer that you want to hear in conversation? If so, let us know at the same place, thestandoutcompany.com/podcast, and we'll do all we can to get them on the show for you. For now, thank you as always for tuning in. Let me introduce today's guest. My guest today is Chris Weston. That is at Chris Weston Photo on Instagram and chrisweston.photography on the World Wide Webs. That is Weston, Weston. Chris grew up in Boston, Lincolnshire. At age 15, his father asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and without hesitation he replied, "I want to be a photojournalist." It wasn't till the age of 32, following a career in the city, that 15-year-old's dream finally came true. Chris took the difficult decision to leave his job and embark on a career as a wildlife photographer. Since then, Chris has never looked back. He has provided images for the BBC, the Sunday Times, the Daily Telegraph, The Guardian and National Geographic. He's written articles for most of the UK photography magazines and books for ITV and numerous publishers, including Animals on the Edge with the prolific art Wolfe and Double Vision. Chris is now in the place where he can call himself an award-winning photographer and has worked with conservation groups including UPROAR. He recently teamed up with the prestigious Travel Photographer of the Year, where he has launched 2 online masterclasses, each containing 50 video tutorials and supporting material covering all aspects of camera technique and the art of composition and visual storytelling. Now, I have heard a lot about Chris from the team over at Travel Photographer of the Year, but our conversation went far deeper than I could ever have hoped for. We discussed the importance of storytelling in photography, mindfulness in photography, which I'll be honest is something I've been subconsciously aware of for a long time but never fully explored. Running a business as an artist, visualization, handling rejection, the importance of saying no to allow you to focus on your own career, and possibly the best reasoning to date I have heard for why mirrorless technology is superior to DSLR. So, without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with the wonderful Chris Weston. Chris Weston, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
Absolute pleasure. The pleasure is all mine. Now, for anyone that perhaps isn't familiar with you or your work, can you please describe yourself and your work as a photographer?
It's always an interesting one because, when people ask me, what do I do for a living, and my instinct is to say I'm a photographer, but the reality is that I do many things which all really relate back to one particular area, which is storytelling. My passion is telling stories, and that's how I initially got involved in photography. In that, as a teenager, I used to have a fascination with inane questions about nature and wildlife, like, why are zebras black and white striped when they live in a yellow savanna? Because that makes no sense. You think camouflage, black and white stripes? No, you stand out like a sore thumb. So, and I had a passion for finding out the answers to questions like that, and so I did. I used to go off and I'd find out why zebras are black and white striped, and then having found the answer, I was desperate to tell people about it. It's like, this is fascinating stuff, and I'm fascinated by it. You've got to be fascinated by it. So I was looking for a medium to tell stories, and I, photography had been a little bit of my past. My dad gave me my first camera when I was 10, and so I had an interest in photography, and so photography became my primary medium for telling stories, and it was for many years, to some extent, the only medium I used. But over time, I've developed into writing, and also more recently into filmmaking. So I guess to answer the question directly, I'm a storyteller who uses photography as a primary medium for communicating with people. Things that I find fascinating about nature and wildlife, and so the passion more is the wildlife and the behavior, and the photography is the means to that end.
I was doing my research last night and this morning before we spoke, and your name is now known and recognised amongst some of the finest working wildlife photographers in the world. Names like Wolfe, for example, who contributed to your book Animals on the Edge. But this is one of the questions I often ask photographers. Has there ever been a sliding doors moment in your career where you'd taken a different path, and had you gone down another route, things could have looked very different? And for you, that choice that you made is very, very clear. You could have gone in a different direction. So would you mind telling us about a particular Monday morning where this all began?
Yeah, you're right. There was a very, very specific moment in my life where, I guess it was quite interesting, actually. I grew up in Lincolnshire, which is not necessarily known as Britain's most aesthetic county. And as a 10-year-old wandering around with a camera, Lincolnshire really did demand a lot of one's imagination. And I remember I was at school when we had, those days we had work experience. You took, a week or 2 weeks off school to go and work in somewhere. And in Lincolnshire, the choices were pretty much manual labor on a farm. It was picking daffodil bulbs or planting potatoes or something along those lines, none of which inspired me. And I was sitting at the dining table, kind of looking through this list of people I could choose to go and do work experience with, and my dad came in and obviously saw this sort of look of turmoil over my face and asked what was going on. So I explained to him, and he said, "Well, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to be a photojournalist." And to be honest, I have absolutely no idea where that answer came from. Because it's not something I'd ever really thought about, but it was the instant answer that came out. And so he suggested that I write to the school and told them that I wanted to be a freelance photojournalist, and that for my work experience I should spend 2 weeks doing that, which I did, and the school agreed, strangely and amazingly. And so at the age of 16, I started what was to be my first, and for quite a long time, my only work assignment as a photojournalist. because after that I got sort of, like a lot of people, I got caught up in life, and I went to work I did a college degree in business and finance, and I went effectively to work in the city, and eventually ended up as a computer salesman, selling corporate networks to large companies like Blockbuster Video, as it was at the time, and I did that for a long time, and I was good at it. I was successful at it. I made a lot of money. I was living just north of London, in a nice house in a village, and I had a family, but inside I was dying, and the morning that you were referring to is I woke up. I was laying in bed, and I remember it distinctly. I can remember the smell in the room. I can remember what I saw out of the window. I can remember what the weather was like that day. And I woke up and I thought, I really don't want to go into the office today. And I do appreciate a lot of people wake up on a Monday morning, think I really don't want to go into work today. But for me, it was a physical feeling. I literally felt sick at the idea of going into work. So I lay in bed for a while, sort of pondering whether to get up or not. And as I was laying there, this quote from one of my all-time favorite books, which is a book called Illusions by an author called Richard Bach, which I'd read about 10 years before. It came literally floating in front of me. It's like I could see the words in the air above me. And that quote was, every now and again, you should ask yourself a question. Am I doing right now what it is I most want to do in the world? And if the answer to that question is no, then you should stop what you're doing and go and do something else. So that thought was kind of playing around in my mind. I got up, I had a shower, I put on my suit, my tie, and I got in the car and I drove to the office and I resigned. And I came home, and my wife at the time was kind of surprised to see me at 10 o'clock in the morning, given she wouldn't see me much at 10 o'clock at night because I was working that hard. And I said, yeah, I've got a new job. And she was mightily impressed when I told her I was now the managing director of a company. She was slightly less impressed when I told her there was no salary attached to this new job, and while I would be traveling around the world to some exotic locations, we probably weren't going to be having a family holiday anytime soon. And that was 20 years ago. And from that moment to this, I've been a wildlife photographer.
It's an incredible story, and I'm sure there's a lot of people listening who that story will resonate with massively, and they would dream of doing exactly what you did. Had you ever made a large life decision like that before that had conditioned you almost to be able to do it? Because it's a very, very brave thing to do. You've got, as you mentioned, you've got a salary, you've got potentially mortgages to service. It's a very, very brave thing to do. Had you done something like that before, or was it something that you just couldn't do any longer?
To be honest, no, not to that extent. I was always a very free-thinking child. I was never one to conform, as my parents would tell you, and I was always a very, I'm not sure optimistic is the right word, but I was always a child that would never put barriers in front of myself. For me, everything was possible, and to this day, that I still feel the same. Anything is possible, and it's something I've tried to instill in my children, that it doesn't matter what your dreams are, you have the ability to make them come true. But in terms of that particular decision, no, and I really had no, it's not something I'd even been thinking about. It's not like I thought, well, okay, in a year's time, I'll give up the job and become a wildlife photographer, so I'll save money to make sure it literally was an instant decision. And I did have a mortgage to pay, and I didn't have a big pot of money in the bank because I'd been living the lifestyle as you do, but it was a decision that was made on the basis that if I carried on doing what I was doing, I probably wouldn't be alive today, because it was a job that was killing me, and if I wasn't dead physically, I would have been dead spiritually and mentally and emotionally. And so, yeah, I think when you look at it in the context of, money and maintaining a particular lifestyle, it might be a difficult decision. And I think that's where most people tend to approach it from, which is, I have commitments, I have family commitments, I have financial commitments, and it's the job that enables those things to exist. When you look at it in the view of actually this is a life and death thing, actually it's a pretty easy decision to make. And to some extent I was fortunate in that having come from a business background, I understood what makes a business successful. And also, having been a salesman for the best part of 10 years, I wasn't afraid of selling. And I think the difficulty that a lot of artists have is separating the art from the business. Because in order to be a financially successful photographer, you have to also be a good businessman or businesswoman. And you have to apply business to what you're doing. And so, I wasn't afraid, for example, the very first thing I started doing was getting out of bed and going and knocking on doors and asking people if they wanted to buy photographs. It was a different industry, but it was the same job. I was a salesman with a camera. But having come from that background, as I say, I wasn't afraid to do that. And so, I approached every single publisher that I could find. I went into Smith's, and I went to the newsstand, and I found every single magazine that used pictures of wildlife in their publications, and I made a list, and I phoned them all up. And it's hard work, and it's I think one of the things is people often say, I'd love to have your job as a wildlife photographer. And yes, that element of it is glamorous. It's a huge amount of fun. I can quite honestly say I gave up work as an IT salesman 20 years ago, and I haven't done a day's work since. But it is hard work, and there's a large element of the job which has got nothing to do with photography. It's all to do with sales and marketing, and today digital marketing, social media, finance, accounting, and you have to do all of those things. As I say, I was fortunate I had experience in that, and so I knew that to be successful as a wildlife photographer, I had to also approach it not just as an artist, but also as a business.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's one of the things that I've been searching for in these interviews, is finding the recipe that enables people like you to perform at the very top. And you're right, there's three elements. There is the work itself, which is the photography. You then also need the business element, because otherwise, as Philip Lee Harvey, who I interviewed, said, you're a bedroom guitarist. Yes. If you can't sell your images, you may be the best photographer in the world, but financially you won't be successful. And then there's the other point which you have beautifully touched on, which is the lifestyle that it offers you, because you weren't happy in your previous job, and now, in your own words, you don't work.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. I mean, I can be working at 2:00 in the morning, and I'm doing it happily because it doesn't feel like work to me. I'm working at 2:00 in the morning because I'm so passionate about what I'm doing at that moment.
Exactly.
That I don't have to stop. And what happens is that rather than going to work to earn a living, you earn a living because you're at work. And it's a subtle difference.
Oh, hang on. Sorry, say that again.
Significant change. Your lifestyle isn't defined by what you do. It's a consequence of what you do.
I like that. Sorry, say that quote again about.
Yeah, so you don't go to work to earn a living. You get a living because you're at work. It's a very different mental approach to what you're doing. It's the fact that the lifestyle that comes off it is a consequence of what you're doing, and because you're doing what you love, then everything in your life improves because of that. Relationships improve because of that. Your relationship with partners, with children, your relationship with yourself, your relationship with friends. Everything gets better because you're now kind of living a life out of passion and not out of drudgery.
Now, you touched on something which I'd like to journey back on slightly, and it's you mentioned some of the things you did once you'd quit your previous job, and I wanted to look at that first year and what it looked like, because the notion of handing in your job and becoming a photographer is very romantic, but it's a lot of work. So what did that first year look like, and what practical steps did you take to begin that journey?
Yes, and often enough, the first year is generally the hardest. A lot of people will tell you that. It's because it's such a huge uplift and so many big changes in one fell swoop that it's not an easy choice. You don't give up work to stop working in that sense. I gave up work to work harder. So it was in some senses a difficult year. But again, the approach I took to it was twofold. One was a mental shift, and one was the physicality of what do I do now. But there was I think it was the film Working Girl, Melanie Griffith, and the other famous actor whose name I can't remember right now. It'll come to me anyway. But it was a film about basically, I think it was about a secretary who wanted to be more than a secretary, and she was trying to get promoted, and her boss came to her and said, "You've got to dress for the job that you want." And it was, funnily enough, it was a saying I heard quite a lot through my business career, dress for the job that you want. And what it meant was that you've got to, if you want to get something, pretend you've already got it. Put yourself in the position that you already have it, and you're far more likely to get it. And so the first thing was that I started calling myself a wildlife photographer. And I had business cards made up with wildlife photographer printed on it. The reality was I'd only just started this job. However, I was a wildlife photographer, so I started to act like a wildlife photographer. And actually, I read a biography of the astronaut Chris Hadfield, who was the first non-US citizen to go into space with NASA. And in part of the biography, he was talking about, how when he first became aware he wanted to be an astronaut, and he said, I was about the age of 8, and some event happened in his life, and he said, that's what I want to do. I want to be an astronaut. And he said, from the age of 8 years old, I started living like an astronaut. I started to eat like an astronaut. I started to exercise like an astronaut. He did everything from the age of 8 to become an astronaut. And hey presto, he became an astronaut. So part of it was a mental shift to say, I am now a wildlife photographer, and I'm going to act like a wildlife photographer, and I'm going to dress like a wildlife photographer, figuratively, not literally. And then the second thing was to sit down and, as I say, just apply the business rules that I would do in my had been my day job, which was, I have a product and I need to sell it. And if you think about a business, most businesses have 3 key members of any board, the only main members of any board. One of them is the CEO, who's in charge of everything. And then you have the chief financial officer, the finance director, and now the COO, the chief operations officer. Everything comes under those 3 headings. So it's all about operations and finance. And the operations side was I need to manufacture products. And my product is photographs. I need to go out and manufacture photographs. And then when I've got that product, I need to sell them to somebody in order to get an income. So as I say, I just sat down and I looked at, how do I, one of the key decisions I made at that point was, this was the beginning of the 2000s. I think it was the year 2000 I actually changed. Digital photography hadn't quite come into the market yet. We were still on film. And however, having worked in an IT industry, I was aware of the potential power of the internet. And I'd done a lot of work actually with British Telecom in their product development area. So I knew what BT were working on in terms of future developments, not 2 or 3 years down the line, but 15, 20 years down the line. And one of the things that became very obvious to me was that the ability to access content and imagery was going to get a lot easier and therefore a lot cheaper. Now, at that point, I would say that the majority of wildlife photographers and nature, landscape, etc., were making most of their money from the stock sales of images. The photos would go into a stock library, Getty or Nature Pictures or somebody like that, and they would get most of their income from the licensing of those images. Well, I looked at the industry and said, well, that's not going to survive, because we're soon going to be able to access images online for free or very cheaply. And the amount of money it was going to cost me to produce enough images in order to make a living is going to far outweigh any future income I get from that industry. Because I think at that point I think the industry average was that one image would be worth £1 per year in income. So if you had 50,000 images in the stock library, you'd get £50,000 of income from it. Well, the cost of producing 50,000 saleable images in film days, when you were paying £10 for a roll of film to be bought and processed, and the amount of travel I would have to do in order to get that number of images, the cost of actually of manufacturing those products was never going to be realized, because by the time I'd actually got there, the industry would be gone. And as we've seen with the power of the internet now, that pretty much you can download images for free off the internet legally. And I know a couple of photographers, very well-known photographers that you mentioned at the beginning of the program, that used to now earn around 10% of what they used to earn from stock imagery. So, as I say, what I did was I just kind of looked at the market and I tried to figure out where it was going, where the potential was. And I think the other thing I did was kind of look at profile, because if I phoned up people 20 years ago and said I'm Chris Weston, a wildlife photographer, most of the time they wouldn't even take the phone call. I wouldn't get past the secretary. And so I did a lot of work very early on to get a book published, because in those days the book was the defining moment. Again, not so much now, because anybody can publish a book today. Self-publishing is a huge industry in itself. So, but in those days, it was a little bit like having an album. If you were a musician, it was the defining element. I've got a book. I'm an author. And so I came up with very early on lots and lots of ideas for books, which I pitched to publishers, and I got I think within the first year I got a book contract from GNC Publishing, which is the publishers that publish Outdoor Photography magazine and black and white photography. And I got a very good working relationship with the commissioning editor at the time, a guy called Paul Richardson, who's now no longer with us. And he gave me my first contract. It was a book called Double Vision, which was shot with another photographer, and it took the premise that if you put two photographers in the same place at the same time, they'll take two completely different pictures. And it was looking at the reason behind that. And so because I got that contract, and because I got a book published within the first sort of 18 months of turning professional, that made a big shift in who would talk to me, opened up a lot of doors to me that that may not have opened up or may have taken much longer to open up. But of course, a lot of that, as I say, it just came down from sheer hard work and putting the foot traffic in to make it happen. As you say, you could be the greatest photographer in the world, but if nobody sees your pictures, then you've already just taken them for yourself, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think there's a lot of people who say they want to be a professional wildlife photographer or photographer actually probably don't. In reality, they would like the bit that they enjoy doing, but the rest of it isn't necessarily what they want to do. And in those cases, I would always say, then don't do it as a profession, do it as a hobby, because the worst thing that you can do is find something that you love and then ruin it. It was for me. It was just about understanding that yes, photography was the aim, but there was also all of this other work that had to go in to making it a success. And doing that early on then created the foundation that allowed me to spend more time doing the photographic part and less time doing the business side.
I think I read something that you'd said you always start with the end in mind.
Yes.
And when it comes to your work, certainly. And I guess what you've just said then about getting the book early on, it's a credibility indicator. And yes, it starts, like you said, as a foundation and a springboard, which can further your career. How did you initially approach those publishers? You mentioned that you pitched to a number of publishers. How did you approach them in the first place? Did you go with a book that you'd created, or did you go with an idea, like the seed of an idea?
It's actually, to be honest, it's almost the exact same process as it is today. It hasn't changed much in the hundreds of years we've been publishing. I think it's one of those things that sort of stands the test of time, and it's also equally as true when you're pitching a film documentary. And so, I mean, I did a bit of research as to how do you approach publishers. I bought a couple of the books that were available at those times about what publishers were after. So part of it is about finding the right publisher for the right product. And I think this is one of the things I often say about photographs is that they need to achieve three things. One is that they have to be interesting. One is they have to be unambiguous. And the third one is they have to be relevant. And it's an important lesson, I think, for anybody who's trying to sell photographs, for example, that you receive a lot of rejections, even now as 20 years in as a well-established photographer. You still get a lot of people rejecting you, but most of the time those rejections are not based on the quality of the product. They're based on the relevance of the product of that particular time. So, for example, if you're pitching to one of the photographic magazines, then don't start sending them pictures of winter scenes in spring, because they're completely irrelevant to what they're doing at that point. So part of the book side of it was finding publishers that were relevant to the sorts of stories I had to tell. And then in those days, you wrote what was called a query letter. So in the query letter, you outlined what the book was, what the title was, what it was about. I don't think I went as far as to writing sample chapters, although some publishers may ask for a sample chapter. But I certainly wrote the table of contents, and so it explained, what the book was, what it was about, how it was structured, and importantly, who it was for, who the audience was, and what you tended to do with those query letters was to identify what the strengths of the publisher were and try to match them with the strength of the book that you were writing. So, and then in those days, because there wasn't email, so it went in the post, and you followed it up with a phone call a few days later. And now a lot of it is done by email. But but it's the same process. And I'm recently getting more and more involved in film and documentary filmmaking as a medium for talking about photography and for disseminating the photographic image. And for documentary, it's exactly the same thing. You write a treatment for the film, you tell them what the film is about, you tell them why you want to make the film, why it's important the film is made. You tell them the structure of the film, which effectively is a table of contents. It's what they call the arc of the film. Who the audience is, where you're going to, or who's going to watch it, where you're going to distribute it, and if they like it enough, they'll say yes. So I say it's a process, like all of these things. Finding the right publisher, finding the right story that's powerful enough, new enough, and interesting enough, and to some extent, showing the ability that you can produce it, because that's actually another really, for a publisher, it's a really key element, particularly for somebody that's just starting out, where you don't have, that background to say, well, I think I've written something like 30 books, so I can go to a publisher now and say I've written 30 books, and they'll say, well, at least we know you can write a book. We're not taking a risk on you. Whereas if it's your very first book, they have that risk of saying, well, we could give you an advance, but are you actually going to deliver this? And of course, for a publisher, for a book publisher, it's a little bit of a lower risk. But let's say for a magazine, Outdoor Photography produces a magazine every 4 weeks. And that magazine is made up of 100 blank pages when it starts out, and they have to fill every single page. And if they commit to giving you 4 of those pages, and then you don't deliver, now the magazine's going out with 4 blank pages in it. Well, that's a risk the editor cannot take. And so editors will always err on the side of caution. They will always go with the known and the reliable, than necessarily go with something that might be new, might be a little bit different, but ends up with a risk of not actually happening. And so again, I think a lot of this is about, when I wrote the query letter, I made sure it was the absolute best piece of work that I had ever done, because that was the only thing that they had to go on that could tell them whether I was going to do the job or not. And for me, I think that's important. Everything that you do, you should do as best that it can be done, or don't do it at all. If you're going to write a query letter, or you're going to write an email to somebody, then write the very best email that there is to be written, because it's a reflection of who you are. And if you put yourself across as somebody who can't be bothered to write a proper email, then you're also putting yourself across as somebody who can't be bothered to do any job right. And I think taking that attitude to how I approached, as a very young, novice, beginner, professional photographer, that approach enabled me to, without any background, without any history in my new chosen career, it allowed me to present myself as a professional. And that then, gives the publisher a little bit more belief in your ability to make them look good, because that's your job. Your job is to make the editor look good.
I think that's a great lesson just for life in general, that you should do the very best you can in every given situation.
It is. I mean, one of my all-time favorite locations for photography is Japan, and Japan is a beautiful country, and it's a beautiful country in terms of its scenery and its wildlife, but it's also a beautiful country in terms of its people. And what I find fascinating about Japan is that they have that attitude. It's inbuilt into their culture. And so, you see, let's say you've taken a ride on the bullet train and you're getting off the bullet train and the cleaners get onto the bullet train. And they clean that carriage until it is spotless. Not necessarily because they want to be a cleaner, but because at that moment, that's what they are doing. and they will do it to the absolute best job that it can be done. And then they step off the train, they step off the carriage, and they bow in respect. And then they go on to the next job. Everything in Japan is done to the best that it can be done, or it's not done at all. It's a beautiful culture to witness, particularly from the West, where I don't think that's necessarily always the case.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And in fact, I was in Singapore last year, and I think, I'm assuming you've been to Singapore.
Yeah.
I think we could learn an awful lot about the way we conduct ourselves when you look at how Singapore is ran. It's quite an incredible place. In Japan, I've not been, but it sounds very similar. I think we could learn an awful lot. You touched on two things which I'd like to journey back on. One of them is storytelling, and the other is telling stories, photographic stories using film techniques. But let's start with storytelling, because there's one image in particular that changed the way you approached your photography, and it was wildebeest migration on the Serengeti in Tanzania.
Yes.
Would you mind talking us through that image and how it changed the way you viewed your photography? Yeah,
I mean, you're right. It was a key image. It was fairly early on in my career, but up until that point, I think I had been approaching photography a little bit, I guess, like a lot of people tend to, which is, I was taking images. I would see something and I would take that image. And then I went on an assignment to photograph the migration, and it was a 3-week-long assignment focusing on the wildebeest. And after the second day in the field, I think I had photographed every single possible behavior of a wildebeest that there could be shot. There are so many wildebeest around at that time that it's not like I was sort of struggling to find the subject. So, but I was looking at all of these images and thinking, they're just records. They're just records of events. They don't really tell me anything. And, they were fine. They were sharp. They were in focus. They were properly exposed, but they had no life to them. They had no soul to them. And I thought, well, I'm here for another 19 days. I've absolutely no idea what I've got to do tomorrow because there isn't another image to take. And so the next day, I decided just to change my tactics a little bit. And I thought, I'm just going to go out without the camera. And I'm just going to observe and see what happens. And a lot of it was about just going out with a completely open mind, and which will probably bring us onto something else a little bit later about the role of mindfulness in photography. But I'm just going to go out, and if I put the camera down, and I'm not going to be constrained by that little rectangular shape that we observe the world through a camera. So I did. I spent an entire day out in the field watching the migration, and at some point during that timeline, I thought to myself, what is migration? And I thought, it's movement. Migration is movement. It's the movement of animals or people from point A to point B. But migration is movement. That is the story. Movement is the story. Wildebeest is just a vehicle for it. But movement is what this assignment is all about. And it was the first time that I understood that photography, as an art form, photography is not about capturing the semblance of a subject. It's about capturing the essence of the subject. It's about going deeper than the surface. It's about getting underneath the surface and finding what the story is. And the best way I've come across to describe it is to consider a passport photograph. Your passport photograph shows the semblance of you. It shows what you look like, but it tells me absolutely nothing about your character. But a great portrait photograph tells me everything about your character. And that's the difference between a record shot and a photograph. And it was through that experience with the wildebeest that I understood that as a photographer, the story generally is never the headline. The story is always what comes underneath. And actually, it's been interesting. I've been watching some interviews with one of the best documentary filmmakers of recent times, a guy called Ken Burns. And one of the things he says is that when you start to write a documentary, and a documentary is just a story, he said sometimes a documentary might be about key figures in history, like kings or presidents or political leaders, but he said you never find the story there. The story is always found in the ordinary people that support and hold up that person or that subject. So it's the same thing. The stories are always underneath; they're never on the surface. And so, that my approach with photography is always that. It's about finding the essence of the subject and not focusing on the semblance of the subject.
I love the analogy with the passport photograph and the portrait. I think that sums it up really, really clearly.
Yes, yeah.
Because it's something we can all relate to as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. It's if you talk to any of the really, really great portrait photographers, and you look at their work, I see pictures on like a photograph on the front of Time magazine, a portrait of a world leader on a Time magazine, and it's shot in such a way that you get the absolute essence of that person just from the way the photograph is shot. But that doesn't come from just sitting somebody down on a stool with some Rembrandt lighting. It comes from the photographer making a connection with the subject that allows the subject to lower the barriers that often exist, particularly in a situation like that, and reveal themselves. And the photograph captures what they reveal about themselves, not what they look like.
You have a really good... It was one of the things I noticed when I was doing my research, actually, just that analogy that you mentioned between the passport and the portrait. You teach a lot now.
Yes.
And we've jumped ahead a little bit here, but I'd quite like to touch on it while we're here. You have a very, very good way of explaining things that are complex and making them very simple to understand. And it's a real, real skill to be able to do. One of them, particularly, I was watching a video last night, and you were describing a mountain in Scotland.
Yes.
And you said that the human brain only processes 1/1000th, was that? Sorry, 1/300th of the image. 1/3000th, I beg your pardon, of the image. And staring me in the face was the fact that the mountain was a triangle.
Yeah.
And that below it, in the water, was another triangle.
Yes.
And it just fascinated me, and I'll put a link in the show notes so people can go and look at that.
Yeah.
The other thing which we'll come on to a bit later on is mindfulness with photography, and you've mentioned it there anyway. And the thing that struck me with that story of the wildebeest was taking that third day to just stop and put the camera down, because there's, particularly in the way we live our lives now, everything is immediate and we're always rushing round, and sometimes to stop and reflect and just look and take in what you are there to do is the best approach sometimes.
I think it's critical, not just in photography but in life as well. And I think I wrote a series of articles for Outdoor Photography a couple of years ago which focused on this particular subject, which is that I think photography is a great way of practicing mindfulness, and in that sense photography actually is a great way of improving the quality of your life. So mindfulness helps your photography, but photography also helps your mindfulness. It's a symbiotic relationship. But I think the thing to mindful, and sometimes I hesitate to talk about mindfulness because it's one of those subjects that sort of become big business. And it's, it was yoga a few years ago, and at the moment it's mindfulness. And there's a lot of people talking about it, and there's a lot of rubbish talked about it. Because I think the thing with mindfulness is understanding what mindfulness actually is, as opposed to what sometimes it's sold as. Because when somebody says to you, be mindful, your immediate response is awareness. Just be aware of what you're doing. But mindfulness actually is made up of three components. Now, one of them is awareness, but it's not awareness about what's going on outside of you. It's awareness about what's going on inside of you. And so when that pertains to photography, as I said, photography for me is about a way of capturing a connection between you and the subject. And that connection isn't happening in a physical, materialistic world. That connection is happening internally. It's a thing that's a chemical reaction inside. But if you say that one of the things a photograph should do is elicit an emotional response in the viewer. Somebody should look at that picture and that photograph, and they should respond to it emotionally. And in order to do that, you have to put emotion into it. But to put emotion into it, you have to understand what the emotion is that you're feeling. And that's what I mean by awareness. So the day that I went out with the wildebeest, that third day, and I left the camera behind, I spent the day trying to understand how I was feeling emotionally about what it was I was observing. And what I'm seeing, what does it mean to me? And trying to capture that's the essence. When I talk about the essence of a subject. So part of mindfulness is about being aware of how you are emotionally responding to a subject so that you can photograph the emotion and not the semblance. Very, very good example of that is actually from that first book I was talking about, the double vision. And the premise of the book was you take two photographers, you put them in the same place, and you compare the images that they take and the differences between them, or the similarities if they exist. And what we did for the book was we split it into 50 different subjects, natural landscape subjects mostly. So forests, rivers, oceans, valleys, trees, all sorts of things. And one of them was cliffs. And it was coming up, we were just a couple of weeks from deadline, and I hadn't got a photograph of the cliff. And I was thinking, this is ridiculous. I mean, I must be able to take a picture of a cliff. I mean, cliffs are beautiful. They're lovely things. And I lived on the coast, for Christ's sake. I live on the Jurassic Coast, which is one of the most beautiful coastlines in the whole of the UK. How can I not take a picture of a cliff? But it doesn't matter how hard I tried. I could not get a picture I was happy with. And so, in fact, I did exactly the same process. I went down to the coast one day without the camera, and I just sat and I watched. And I became aware in that time that the reason I couldn't take a photograph of the cliff was I don't like cliffs. I hate them because I see a cliff as a barrier between the merging of the land and the ocean. There's this great big monstrosity that's sitting like a brick wall that stops land and water merging. I don't like cliffs. Now, as soon as I understood that my emotion was a negative emotion, that's the photograph I went and shot. I shot a picture of a cliff that told the world I don't like cliffs. I shot a picture of a cliff that showed the cliff as a barrier, not as this beautiful piece of coastline stretch, because that's not how I felt about them. The reason I couldn't photograph them was because I was trying to photograph something I didn't feel. As soon as I started to photograph what I felt, I instantly got the picture. So mindfulness is partly about being aware of how you are responding to anything that is going on in life. And of course, when you bring that into, let's say, a relationship, let's say you're having an argument with your partner, and you're responding to the argument, which obviously often makes things worse because you tend to respond in your subconscious behavior, which is maybe what started the argument in the first place. And they're pressing your buttons with what they're saying to you. They're pressing buttons, and those buttons are firing you, and vice versa. It's going on, it all gets heated. But if you could step back from that and you could watch yourself emotionally respond to what's going on, you can make a conscious decision to change your response to it. You don't have to respond badly. You can respond positively if you want to, just by changing your mind about how you actually respond to something. And that's where mindfulness plays a part in our everyday life. So, you're driving down the road, somebody cuts in front of you. You're in one of those lanes that goes from 2 lanes to 1 lane. And the guy comes up the outside lane and cuts in front, and you start screeching and screaming and doing hand signals through the window. Well, you're choosing to respond that way. It's not what he's done. Because you can choose to absolutely ignore it. It's up to you. And of course, the response that you have only affects you. The guy in the car in front doesn't care how you're feeling. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done what he just did. He doesn't care. He's not going to affect his life. Well, not one iota, but you've ruined the rest of your day because you're going to still be thinking about it at lunchtime or at dinner time. So being mindful allows you to consciously respond differently to how your brain is naturally programmed to respond based on how we've grown up and how we've developed individually. The second thing that mindfulness is, and this is where the camera becomes an obstacle, is to not be judgmental. We're constantly judging things. We're judging the guy who drove up the outside lane and cut us up. Who knows? Maybe he's got a child in the back who needs to get to the hospital. We don't know. But because we judge them for what they've done, we respond in a particular way. And the big problem with the camera is that as soon as you put a camera in your hand and you put a camera to your eye, you start to judge. The light's not right. The subject's not interesting. I've got the wrong lens. I'm in the wrong position. The weather's terrible. We start to judge things. And that judgment narrows creativity. Because as soon as you put barriers onto anything, you start to narrow the opportunity for it to be something else. And the third thing about mindfulness is to not be attached to an outcome. And that's another great thing with photography. We often go out with a camera and we have to get the shot. You go on a photo safari and I've got to come back with 3,000 images. And because you're now attached to an outcome, if that outcome doesn't happen, you're liable to be disappointed. I want to get a shot of the kingfisher coming off the branch and diving into the water with its beak breaking the water. But if you don't get that shot because the circumstances don't happen, not only do you go home disappointed, but because you've focused all of your attention on that one particular outcome, you've missed all of the other things that have been going on at the same time. And the thing I've learned, certainly with photographing wildlife, is that in every single image, there are 50, 100, 1,000 different images in that one shot. There's a great technique you can do, actually, which is take an image of yours, pull it up on screen in Photoshop or Lightroom or something, and just start cropping into it, just as an exercise, to see how many different images that you can create out of that one. And now imagine that you could go back to that moment in time when you took the original picture and you spent the time to create all of those additional images at the same time. So I think mindfulness plays a huge part in not just photography, but also in our everyday life. It's about being aware of how you're responding. It's about removing judgment so that you can look at things with an open mind. And you can open your mind to creativity and not being attached to an outcome so that creativity has somewhere to go other than one perceived channel or preconceived channel.
That's a great technique about cropping into an image to see how many you can make. It's something I hadn't even thought about, because you look at an image and you think that's the image.
Yes.
But what if it's not? like you said, what if there's 50 images within that one image?
Yes. Yeah. It's it's for learning. I mean, one of the difficulties, particularly, in some ways, it's a little bit easier for me because because I do this for a living. I often have a lot more time than a hobbyist, let's say, to practice my photography. And sometimes I know for a lot of people that it might be one weekend a month, or it's the 7-day or the 10-day holiday that they have once a year where they get time to really go and invest in their photography. And and I know it well. I used to be there. Before I turned professional, that's what I did. Photography was a hobby, and I did it when I could, which was very rarely, because we get caught up in work commitments, family commitments, social commitments, and things like that. So, I think in some ways, it's the pressure for me as a photographer professionally is I have to come back with images because that's what pays the bills and it's what pays the mortgage. If you're a non-professional, I think you're under exactly the same amount of pressure, just for a different reason. And that is you've got to come back with images because it may be the only chance you have that year to be in Africa to get the shot of the lion that you wanted. And you may not be going back for another year or 2 years or maybe never. So the pressure to actually produce is the same. It's just a slightly different reason for it. And so I think anything that you can do to practice photography before you go on a big photographic trip, or even a short weekend or whatever it is, before you go out with the camera, then the better off you'll be when you get there. And again, just using an analogy, is a little bit like, if you think about anything, photography is a skill and it requires practice, just like playing an instrument, playing golf, tennis, sport, whatever. But you look at the great masters of golf, let's say, Tiger Woods or Rory McIlroy. They don't practice golf during the Masters. They practice golf before the Masters, so that when they get there, they do it automatically. And I think that's what we should do with photography. If you want to get really, really good at photography, you need to practice it. And the best time to practice it is when you're not taking pictures. So, and I think any technique that you can do, while you're at home, that will allow you just to think differently when you get out into the field will be a benefit. And that is certainly one of them, because, I think we often, we get caught up in the moment a lot. If it's the first time you've seen a lion, let's say a wild lion, there's all that excitement going on, and it's hard to think compositionally when you're so excited about what's going on in that moment. But if you've trained your mind to think that way before you get there, it doesn't matter if it's the first time you've seen a lion or the 100th time you've seen a lion, your mind already knows what to do because you've trained it. It's like muscle memory. And yeah, there is, for sure, in any scene, there are 100 different ways to photograph it. And if you photograph all 100 of them, now you've got 100 images, not just one image. And this is another reason that, I think people, whenever they go somewhere, they should take time just to sit and be with that subject for a while, because it takes time for the images to start appearing and the ideas to start forming as to how you can photograph something. And it's particularly true of wildlife, of course, because if let's say, you're in Africa, you're in a jeep, there's a cheetah on the side of the road, or some antelope or elephants, whatever, and you drive up. Well, for the first 5 or 10 minutes, those elephants or those animals are not going to start behaving normally because they're worried about what you're doing. If you sit for 20 minutes and they start to realize that you're not a threat, then they go back to behaving naturally. And that's when the images occur. So, I always tell people, don't chase the shot. Don't chase the photograph. Let the photograph come to you. And I think that's a nice way of sort of saying, if you're sitting watching, let's say, a herd of wildebeest, then just change the focal length and focus in on different bits. Look at the detail as opposed to the whole. A wildebeest is made up of all sorts of things: line, shape, pattern, color, and texture. Photograph those as elements. Start to pull them out. Turn the camera vertically as opposed to horizontally. Completely changes the perspective. get lower down and shoot up at the subject at a totally different perspective than eye level. There are all sorts of things that you can do just to change the energy of a composition and create another version of the story. And it's not right, it's not wrong, it's just a different story. And every story is another story. And that is the power of it.
I'm glad you mentioned about zooming in to a shot to capture something different, because it was one of the things you mentioned earlier, which I said I would journey back to. So let's talk about photographic technique. I beg your pardon. Shooting still images using film techniques. Yeah. So I saw something that you spoke about on your website, I believe, and you said, oh no, I tell a lie, it was in the Amateur Photographer magazine in 2017, how filmmaking techniques can benefit your photography. And you said the secret to shooting a successful photographic portfolio is combining the two parallel but different ways of seeing and thinking, which are moments and time. And you can achieve this by capturing an establishing shot, a long shot, a medium shot, a close-up, and an extreme close-up. Now, I have worked in and around television for best part of 20 years, and I'll be honest with you, I have never ever made that connection between film and telling a story through photography in that fashion. And as soon as you started saying it, it was like a light bulb. I suddenly went, well, of course, because that's how we shoot things on set, because that's how you tell a story. So why would you not transfer that to photography? So firstly, let's start with anyone that's unfamiliar with these type of shots. Can you describe what they are? And secondly, an example of where and when you use them in your work.
Yeah, so it is a fascinating area. I really came across it because while I'm very interested in documentary filmmaking as an art, as a medium, and however, I'm not particularly keen on or interested in being the videographer. My main interest in film actually is in the editing, which is really where the story gets told. But I don't really have any great desire to be a cameraman. I'm happy being the stills photographer. And so because of that, I hooked up with a guy who was a colleague of a friend of mine, ex-BBC natural history cameraman, and we've known each other for 15 years or so now, and become very, very good friends. But we used to often have this conversation. I as a stills photographer, and he as a cameraman, and what we discovered was that there is a very significant difference between what I do and what he does in the way that we see the world. Because in photography, we see in moments. We see an entire story captured in 1/500th of a second. In film, they have to see in sequences, because it's not just about what you're shooting now, but it's about how am I going to get what I'm shooting now to seamlessly connect with what I'm going to shoot tomorrow, and to seamlessly connect with what I shot yesterday. And so it's a very different way of seeing. And we started to kind of recognize that there were things I could teach him, particularly about composition of the individual frame. And there were things that he could teach me about how to see an image that went beyond just the individual frame. And a very simple way of looking at that is in terms of creating, let's say, a portfolio of images that work together, a portfolio that is greater as the whole than it is as the one. Perfect example, the wedding album. The wedding album is made up of a sequence of events captured in moments, but when the wedding, a good wedding photographer will put those sequences, those still images together in a sequence that tells the story of the wedding. Now, those sequences may be the establishing shot, which is the wide-angle shot of the churchyard with the bell ringers in the foreground and the vicar and the groom waiting for the father of the bride waiting for the bride to turn up. And so there's your establisher. Now you know that we're at a wedding at a church. in the country, let's say. You then move into, you know, through the degrees, you can kind of move into the medium shot so the car turns up with the bride in it. And so you have the shot of the car door with the bride through the window. She hasn't got out yet, or she's just stepping out of the car, but you've got most of the car in the picture. That's your medium shot. And you take that all the way through to the extreme close-up, which is the putting the ring on the finger or the signing of the register, which is a really tight shot where you just see the hand and the pen, or you just see the bride's hand with the ring on it and maybe his hand and nothing else. And you don't need to see anything else, because the bride is not the story, the groom is not the story. In this case, it's the ring is the story. And I said before that, you know, all images, all photographs have to achieve three things. They have to be interesting, they have to be unambiguous, and they have to be relevant. So the ambiguity thing comes in when I think the biggest mistake that most photographers make, and the number one reason that most photographs fail to work as a photograph, is because we include too much competing information. And this is, you mentioned before that I start a photograph with the end in mind. And it's critical, because if I don't know what I'm photographing, I have absolutely no idea how I'm going to compose it. I have absolutely no idea what equipment I'm going to need to shoot it. If I don't know that that's the end goal, how do I know how to create it? So, you know, you take the idea of the wedding ring. The subject is the ring. Subject is not what the bride's hair looks like that day. And it's not what the flowers look like that day. It's not the color of her dress is not relevant to that story. The ring is the story. And so the only thing that should be in that picture is the ring, because anything else starts to confuse the message. And that's where this kind of concept of taking different views and different angles and going from wide crops to narrow crops. And again, let's say let's say you're looking at an elephant. There are multiple ways to photograph an elephant, but it depends what your story is. So if your story is an elephant in its environment, then you want a wide angle shot where you see the environment, because the environment is part of that story. If your story is poaching and elephant tusks, well, the background is pretty much irrelevant to that story. The tusk is the important thing. And so you in that case, I'd get a longer focal length lens, or preferably you'd get physically closer to the subject. And you'd frame it so that the tusk was the only thing in the picture space. And so, again, going back to what we were saying before, that within any one scene, there are multiple stories to be told. And that, something as simple as an elephant, even if you just take those 5 basic film shots, so establisher, medium, close-up, extreme close-up, and extreme close-up, you can just apply those simply to one particular subject. Elephant in its environment, elephant, full portrait of an elephant, headshot of an elephant, picture of the tusk, picture of the eyeball and the eyelashes. 5 shots from one scene. And you can expand on that as much as you want to, but yeah, it's about sort of saying, just again, this comes back to the mindfulness thing. Open your mind up to the potential. Open your mind up to the possibility of what something can be, and not just what you subconsciously see it as. Because you mentioned the film clip about the mountain, and the problem that we have as human beings, and it's a problem but also a benefit, in that this is what allows us to navigate the world that we live in successfully, is that our brain does not see detail. Our brain sees patterns. It sees everything in patterns. And so writing, for example, words. When we see a word, we don't read every individual letter. We don't even see every individual letter. We see the pattern of the word and we can read it. And that's what allows us to read quickly. It's also the reason that on motorways and now on all road signs, the lettering is in lowercase. in the old days, before motorways, it was all in capitals. But we never read in capitals. We read and see the pattern of the lowercase letter. So when they invented roads where cars were going to be driving much, much faster, and therefore we needed to be able to read the sign more quickly, they put everything back down to pattern recognition. Our brain navigates the world through recognizing patterns. It ignores detail, creates from the pattern, it tells you what it is, and it says, so what you're looking at is a mountain. And you go, it's a mountain. Let me take a picture of a mountain. The problem is that mountain is made up of line, shape, color, pattern, and texture. Everything in life is made up of line, shape, color, pattern, and texture. Your brain ignores those 5 things and says it's a mountain. But you can if you can train your brain, and you can do it, because it's not something that came naturally to me. I'd learned it. Is you learn to switch off that filter that the brain has, so that you start to see the detail, and it's the detail where the stories lie. It's like I was saying about the documentary about the king. The overriding story might be the king, but the detail of the story, the really interesting stories, are not the king, but the people who ordinary people that come underneath him, who know the stories about the king that you really want to know, not what the king wants to tell you. So it's the same thing: line, shape, color, pattern, and texture. That's where the stories are. The mountain is just the consequence of those. And if you can, because the point about the way the eye sees, because it's really actually quite interesting, is exactly the same as a JPEG file in a camera. When you record a JPEG, what happens is the camera takes this whole scene and it says, right, well, out of the 25 million pixels in this scene, 12 million of them are the same color blue sky. I don't need to record all of those 12 million pixels. I just need to record 1 pixel as my reference, and I can ignore the rest of it. And then when you come to open the picture up on the computer, I'll just fill in the blanks from the reference pixel. That's how a JPEG works. That's why JPEGs are so much smaller than RAW images. And that's exactly what the brain does. It sees something and says, well, I know that that's what that is based on my knowledge and my experience. And so I don't need to recognize the shape, color, pattern, and the texture. I just need to tell you that it's a mountain so that you can decide whether to climb up it or not. Or I need to recognize that it's a river so that you can decide whether to jump over it or not. You don't necessarily notice the smell of the water or the sound of the water even. All of those things that are going on that your brain is ignoring. And what happens is that your eye sees what it sees, and it sees everything. Just like the sensor of a camera, it picks up every single piece of detail that there is to be seen. But on the journey from the eye to the center of the brain, which is via the visual cortex at the back, it goes to the middle, it gets compressed by a factor of 3,000. So what your brain tells you have seen is 1/3,000th of the data that the eye actually collected. And my question is, well, if I'm only seeing 1/3,000th of what my eye saw, what am I missing? What's in all of that stuff that my brain has decided to ignore, that there might be a story in there? And the picture of the mountain that you were referring to is very specific, because when I was looking at that scene, and it's a very famous mountain in Scotland. It's famous because it's one of the easiest mountains to get to in Scotland. It's in Glencoe, and it's about. The actual mountain, the bit where you photograph it is literally 20 yards from the road, and it's about 100 yards off the main road that goes through Glencoe. It's so easy to get to, and it's a beautiful mountain, and it's got a waterfall in the foreground and a river front. It's a big, spectacular view. But when I went to photograph it, I didn't look at the mountain. I looked at the shapes, the colors, the patterns, and the textures, and the lines. And what I saw was not the mountain. I saw the little shape of the triangle in the water created by the rocks that just perfectly mirrored the mountain in the background. I saw the detail because I trained my brain to stop seeing a mountain as a mountain and to start seeing a mountain as an element of design. because that's what composition is about in photography. Composition is about designing an image that tells a story in the most unambiguous way that story can be told.
We talked quite a lot there about starting with the end in mind in terms of building that shot.
Yes.
If I may, I'd like to expand on that beyond actually taking a photograph, because when I was looking at your work, for many photographers, you could have an amazing career and have worked on incredible jobs, but if you're not careful, your whole career could be dictated by others. And I mean in terms of what comes through the door from clients and things like that. Yours, on the other hand, feels very much like it's been designed, like you've designed your career. You know, you travel, you teach, you shoot things that you want to shoot on your own time frame most of the time, I'm assuming. So what will you now say no to in your career that allows you to focus on what you want to do? Because it's hard, because at the start of anyone's career, the temptation is to say yes to everything because you want to learn, but then there becomes a tipping point where you become more successful and people then want you, but that can pose its own challenges because it can distract you from what you actually want to do.
Yeah.
So as you now become more successful, what do you now say no to allow you to focus on your goals?
It's a very, very good point, and it's a very true point. Because yes, certainly at the very beginning, and you tend to think, well, yeah, I'll just say yes because it's a job, it's income. Quite often people say yes even when there isn't any income because it's a job. And to be fair, a lot of the media prey on that thought process. And they'll say, well, we'll get you, we'll give you credits and we'll put your byline, and and the reality is, of course, that none of that actually ends up paying the bills. So it is very easy at the beginning to say yes to everything. I think part of it was, from my perspective, was that because I came into photography in the manner which I did, which was coming from a job I didn't want to do, I was adamant that moving into wildlife photography, I wasn't going to fall into the same trap. I became a wildlife photographer because I had a passion and I had a mission to communicate stories about wildlife which I felt were important and needed to be told. And so what defined my career up to that point was I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do. But it is also very true to say that, I did take on projects that paid the bills. They were more aligned to what I wanted to do, but not directly. And I mean, a very good example of that is the fairly sort of generic how-to photography book. I think I've written 5 of them. And so I wrote the first one, then I got a commission to write another one. And then some other publisher had seen the 2 I'd written and said they wanted me to write one for them. And I think I got to the 5th book. And as I started writing it, I thought, I have no idea, because I can't write the same book because that's plagiarism, even if I'm plagiarizing myself. That there's a copyright that belongs to the other publisher. So, and I just sat there and thought, I have no idea how to write this because I've already written it the best way it can be written. That was the first book. And the second one was a slight compromise on the quality of the first one because I had to make it. Well, there are, photographic technique actually isn't rocket science. It's very, very simple when you come down to it, because every single camera that has ever been invented, from the most modern Nikon, Canon, Fuji camera of today, back to the very first camera that ever came out, it works on one defining principle, which is you have to let a certain amount of light in through a hole for a certain length of time. And that's it. Everything else is just fluff around the edges. photography is about lens aperture and shutter speed in reality. And, yes, as cameras have got more complicated, there are more things to think about. But at the end of the day, camera technique is finite. So there is only so much you can say about it. So after the fifth book, where I kind of thought, I'll write it, and I'll write it the best way I can write it, and I'll try to make it different. And it was a little bit more up to date because the first one was about film cameras and this was about digital. So, there were some defining differences, but I thought I'm not going to write another book on camera technique because I've got nothing left to say. And I didn't. The online course, which is about camera technique, I did because it was a different medium. It was a different way of talking about photography. It was a different audience, a different way of reaching that audience. And so I was able to create something new about an old subject, which made it feasible. But it would be very, very difficult to write another book on camera technique because I've already written it. So there are elements like that that certainly I started to say no to. I think also with the travel side of the business, I started to be very defined in what I wanted to teach on my photography workshops and holidays, which was much more about trying to take people from this concept that we talked about earlier, take people from this concept of just photographing the semblance of something and getting them to understand what I mean when I say photograph the essence of something. Because for me, that's when a hobbyist photographer makes a shift in their ability to capture compelling images more regularly. It's not about the camera. It's not about camera technique. It's about the mindset that you approach photography. And so I started to design photographic courses that weren't just about taking people to the tripod locations for all of the great photo hotspots, but it was about helping people to grow as photographers, not just technically, but more so grow it personally as an artist. So I guess I started to define, what is it I have to give to the world that I think is either missing or could be given in a better way. And I've always approached my business from that perspective, which is why I've always been able to move forward and not get stuck in a particular style or particular business plan. Because it's always a shifting trend, and it's like film and video now. I mean, I remember when video for a stills photographer, videography was like the devil incarnate. God forbid we should ever put a video camera in a stills camera. Try buying a stills camera today that doesn't have a video in it. So, it's a different medium, but it's a medium that does the same thing, just in a different way. It tells stories. And the other thing from a purely commercial perspective is that in the old days, if let's say you were supplying images to National Geographic magazine, well, before the internet, National Geographic will quite happily take an image or a story, a journalistic story where there were a set of images and maybe some words to go with it, or they might just take a portfolio. If you want to sell to National Geographic today, then not only do you need the image and the story, but you need the film that goes with it, and you need the film of how you made the image, because National Geographic isn't a magazine. It's an online multimedia company, and they need multimedia, not one media. So, embracing video is partly for me, a passion about another way to tell stories, but it's also partly commercial. It means that I have a broader product to offer the client than if I was just a photographer. And so, I think, part of it, I think on the whole, is about doing what you want to do and not doing what you are told to do. As I said, actually, if you look back at my childhood, as a kid, I was always doing what I wanted to do, and I rarely did what I was told to do. Whether that was parents, teachers, or any other form of authority. I've always tried to live a life that was what I wanted. And I think that's why I got to such a bad place in the business world, that I knew it was not what I wanted to do, and yet I was compromising myself to be there, which is why in the end I had to give it up and do what I wanted to do.
I think that is a really lovely way of looking at life in general, not just photography. All right, I'm going to try a few quick fire questions, which actually I've done with a lot of photographers, and then when doing my research for our conversation, I noticed that on your website you have something very similar. So this was trickier than it appeared. So I've tried to throw in a few curveballs, but some of these, I must confess, are on your website. So DSLR or mirrorless?
Mirrorless. And it's not just about size and weight, which is, I think, is a very good reason for a lot of people to shoot mirrorless. And I know certainly a lot of my safari clients, are not getting any younger, and picking up a big heavy Nikon D5 or 6 or a Canon 1DS, actually is difficult. I'm not a spring chicken anymore either, and it's difficult for me. So, and I know that they hugely benefit with that much lighter weight camera. Certainly from a year or so ago, I was chasing after snow leopards in the Himalayas in the middle of winter, and the idea of carrying a 50-kilogram backpack full of the necessary camera gear, just would have been ridiculous. Mirrorless made that job so much easier purely by just taking the weight out of the camera bag. So size and weight are one thing, but actually for me the whole thing with mirrorless is much more defined in that. For me, image quality is always the overriding factor, and the big problem with an SLR, DSLR, SLR camera is the mirror, because it has so many negative connotations to it in terms of camera design, that if you were designing a camera from scratch today, you just wouldn't even conceive of putting a mirror in there. It's big and it's heavy, and it's a mechanical mechanism that moves. So number one, it's the one thing that's going to go wrong next to the shutter. Second thing is that in order to accommodate it, you have to make a physically bigger camera. The weight of the mirror and the mirror mechanism adds to the weight of the camera, as does the extra size of the camera. The mirror flapping up and hitting the chamber every time you take a picture causes camera vibration. So you've got to deal with that. And the other big thing, and one of the biggest things that people very rarely talk about, is that by putting the mirror in the camera, it pushes the lens further away from the sensor plane, because you've got a 1-inch mirror to accommodate. So the lens is say pushed further forward of the mirror, which means the light from the back of the lens has to travel further before it hits the sensor. And anybody in the old days of film who used to shoot rangefinder cameras will tell you that the image quality of a rangefinder camera wasn't just down to the optics; it was down to the fact that the lens was practically sitting on the film. And you have the same thing with a mirrorless camera. Because the mirror is now gone, the lens is much, much closer to the sensor. And so the light transmission from the back of the lens to the sensor is much cleaner. So optically, it's better. It's lighter. It's physically smaller. You don't have to worry about a mirror getting or causing camera shake because of slapping up and down. It just makes so much sense not to have a mirror in your camera. And now that the functionality of the top of the range mirrorless cameras is on a par with SLRs, particularly in terms of autofocus, which was for a long time was the big fall down. It just makes complete sense. And you think about it, video cameras have been using mirrorless technology almost since day one. So it's not like it's cutting edge, bleeding edge science. It's a pretty proven technology. So that was a long answer to a quick fire question. I'm sorry.
No, don't be at all. I think it's probably the best reasoning for a mirrorless system rather than a DSLR. So no, please do not apologise. Prime or zoom?
For wildlife photography, I'll always go with zooms. And there are two main reasons behind it. One is just the flexibility of being able to change the focal length and the angle of view when you can't physically move yourself because of the circumstances. So, I mean, I would always advise, if it's possible to get closer to your subject by physically picking up the tripod and walking closer, that's what you should do. But when you're photographing wildlife, often that's not possible. It might not be safe for you. It almost certainly isn't safe for the animal. You don't want to be in a position where you're disturbing an animal doing what it does naturally just so you can get closer. And so, the ability to very quickly change the focal length from 100 mil to 150 mil, let's say, particularly with a subject that's often moving very, very quickly, like wildlife, just makes it far more practical than a prime. And the second reason is that often, again, with where I'm shooting, I'm often working in camera hostile environments, very, very dusty, very wet. And of course, every time you change the lens, then dust is going to get into the chamber. That's going to hit the sensor. And potentially not necessarily ruin an image, but certainly create more work. So what I tend to do is I have three main lenses, which are my workhorse lenses, which are 24 to 70, 70 to 200, and 200 to 400. And I have three camera bodies that I take with me and one lens on each of them. And that way I can pretty much 95% of an assignment I can fulfill without ever having to take a lens off the camera body.
That makes life a lot easier, doesn't it?
It does.
A lot easier. Colour or black and white?
Oh, that's a tough one. To answer that question, you have to understand the psychological impact of black and white, because I think for some images, black and white is absolutely the right way to go. And for other images, colour is the right way to go. So it's not really an either or. But it comes down to the elements of design: line, shape, colour, pattern, and texture. And if you take those five elements, by far the most overpowering of those for humans is colour. And it's so overpowering that it diminishes all of the others. And again, just looking at analogies, a great way to think about it is human senses. We have five senses, and sight is our most overpowering sense. We are visual creatures. We navigate our world through vision. And because we see things, quite often when we go about our daily life, we don't hear a lot of the sounds that are going on around us. We ignore the smells that are going on all the time. Really great little exercise. Sit down in your living room or go and sit on a park bench and close your eyes for 10 minutes. And you will start to hear sounds that you were completely and utterly oblivious to when your eyes were open. Because once you remove the power of sight, it gives the other senses room to breathe. You'll actually start to smell the grass and things like that. You'll start to hear bird sounds that you didn't hear before. You'll hear people talking that you were oblivious to. People who are blind have a far more acute sense of hearing than we do, with sighted people do, because they have to compensate for the loss of that one. And exactly the same thing happens in design. So in a color photograph, the color overpowers line, shape, pattern, and texture. So if you're taking a photograph where texture is a very important part of the composition, then if you shoot in black and white, by removing the color, texture has room to breathe. You start to see texture that would have been covered up by color. And that's why often if you see a lot of the industrial landscapes, which are all about texture, and the power of a dark, brooding sky. They're almost always shot in black and white. And the reason is because you start to be able to emphasize the other elements of design that would otherwise get lost if you shot it in color. So in answer to the question, it depends very much on what the subject of my image is. There's a picture of I think it's on the website, of a hippopotamus shot in black and white, and it's just the head just sticking out of the water. You can see I think you can see its nostrils, but mostly it's just the top of the head and the eyes. And it all came about because it was right at the end of a day. I was photographing in Kruger National Park in South Africa, and it's a place called Sunset Dam, which is right next to one of the exits of the park. So it's where everybody ends up before they have to get out of the park at 6 o'clock. And it's a great spot for hippos and crocodiles. And it was late in the day. It was an overcast day. It was flat lighting. What light was there was terrible. In fact, I put all the cameras away, and I was just watching. I was just watching what was going on, and this hippo popped its head up, and I was just watching him. And looking at him, I suddenly realized, because when you think about a hippopotamus, you kind of think of this sort of big, grey, smooth-skinned blob. But if you look at the top of a hippopotamus's head, it is immensely shapely, and there's this fantastic texture on the top, where all this this bobbly skin, and it was just beautiful. Now, I took the camera back out and I took the photograph, and I shot it knowing that I was going to turn it into black and white. Now, obviously, the picture is in color because it was shot on a digital camera. And if you look at the color image, it's just a record shot of a hippo. You turn it into black and white and you start to see what I saw, which was the shape and the texture of the head. Now, the caption for that image is not hippopotamus. The caption for the image is shape and texture. And so there was a definitive reason for removing color, because my story was shape and texture, and I knew that by removing color, that story would be more powerful and would become unambiguous. Color put in ambiguity. Taking color away made the story unambiguous. And I think that's the importance of understanding. We talk in photography about the rules of composition, and there are design rules, if you like, rule of thirds, etc. The key to understanding composition is not knowing what the rule is. It's knowing why the rule exists. Because if you understand why the rule exists, then you can understand when to use it and when not to use it. Yes, I think that answers that question.
Yes, it does. And actually, I think in general, one of the eye-opening things from speaking with you is the notion of, and we've said it time and time again, starting with the end in mind in order to tell the story, because it answers so many questions. Yes. I could ask you these 20, whatever they are, questions all day long: Canon or Nikon, color or black and white, prime or zoom. The answer is always the same. If you know what the end goal is, it answers those questions.
Sometimes, you might be on a photo shoot somewhere and somebody will say, what shutter speed should I use for this shot? And the honest answer to the question is, I don't know, because I don't know what the intention is. If the question is, I want to create a pin-sharp image of this shot, what shutter speed should I use? Then I can answer the question. Or I want to create motion blur, what shutter speed should I use? I can answer the question. But without that defining piece of information, which is, what is your story? What is your intention? Quite often on forums, I want to buy a second lens for my camera. Which one should I get? Well, how does anybody actually answer that question? Because until you know what you want to do with the lens, it's like going into a car showroom and saying, you want to buy a car. What would you recommend? Well, I don't know. Do you want to buy a car for driving around a racetrack? Or have you got 5 kids that you need to ferry around? Or, I've got heap loads of camera and filming equipment I need to carry. So, the latest 2-seater Mercedes is beautiful, but actually not much use to me. So there's always got to be a purpose. And you don't necessarily have to define it days, weeks, hours even before you do the shot. Although often I will do that. I come up with ideas for photographs, and it might be months before I actually go out and take that image. But the idea is there, and I sometimes I even go as far as figuring out exactly what equipment I need, exactly what camera settings I'll need to capture that image. And then a year later, I may be in a position to do it. Sometimes it happens in the moment. So it's not that I necessarily have always had a clear indication of what the story is when I set out. But what I've noticed is that when I'm sitting watching something happening in front of me, I'm always asking myself a question. This is a really, really good technique for your listeners to practice. When you're looking at a scene, just before you press the shutter, ask yourself the question, how would I caption this image? And if the only answer you can come up with is a species name, a bird, don't take the picture, because that's the record shot. If the bird opens its mouth and starts to sing, well, bird singing is a far more powerful caption than bird. And you'll find that the picture of the bird with its mouth open, its beak open, is a far more powerful picture than the picture of the bird with its beak closed. So the better the caption, the stronger the image is likely to be. And I'm always asking myself that question before I press the shutter. What's the story here? What's the story? And it could be in a blink of an eye I come up with a story. Now, again, it's because I've been doing that for 20 years that I've kind of honed it as a subconscious thing. It's something that now, like driving a car for most people, you don't think about how you drive a car. You don't do it consciously. You get in the car, you end up in point B, and most of the time you don't even realize how you got there. Because I've been doing it all the time, it becomes second nature. But everybody can get there. I've only got there because I happen to have practiced it. We can all do that, and you don't have to be out with a camera. You can be standing on you'd be standing on a subway platform, tube station platform. That might not be the case these days. Wherever you happen to be standing, socially distanced from everywhere else, you can just be out and just watch what's going on and ask yourself, how would I caption that image? How would I caption that image? You could be out with the kids playing in the park. How would I caption that image? And the more you do it, whenever you do pick up a camera, when you get that opportunity to pick up a camera, it will become natural for you to say the same thing. How do I caption this image? The stronger the caption, the better the picture.
I think that is very nearly the perfect way to end our conversation, but I am going to ask you one more question. I'm going to leave the quick fire because the answer is always the same. What is your story and what is your motivation? Why? So I'm not going to continue with them, but what I'm going to ask you is, do you have we've probably covered the answer multiple times, but do you have a photography motto that you stick by and live by? So for example, I think Apple had, when they first invented the iPod, they said 1,000 songs in your pocket. For example, it was short, it was sweet. Do you have something that is your photography caption?
That's a very good question. Yeah, actually, yes. I mean, for me, and I'd love to say that this was entirely mine, but the truth is that I borrowed it from the Japanese, who I think borrowed it from the Chinese.
That's all right. John Lennon said, "Talent borrows, genius steals." So, do not apologise.
I think my overriding view is that in order to capture a compelling photograph, you have to have three things. You have to have three attributes. You have to have a good hand, an insightful eye, and a creative mind. And 2 out of 3 won't do. You've got to have them all in order to become a great artist. Now, if you that was actually taken from Chinese painting, taken over to Japan with their calligraphy, and I've borrowed it for photography. I think one of the British painters also used it in painting at one point. But in terms of photography, the hand is camera technique. You've got to know how to use the camera. in order to get the camera to do what you want it to do. You've got to have an insightful eye, which is the ability to see the design within the image. How do you compose an image so that it tells the story in the very best and clearest way that it can be told? And the creative mind is, how do you see the stories that other people don't? And this, the concept of you have to have all three is that, you can be the most creative person in the world, and you might know how to design an image, but if you don't know how to get the camera to capture that image, you won't take a great picture. And you might know everything that there is to know about camera technique, and you might know everything there is to know about composition. But if you never have an original idea, you won't capture a perfect image. So photography is about bringing together those three key elements: camera technique, composition, and creativity. And if you can do that, then you'll be the complete photographer.
Chris Weston, thank you ever so much for joining us on the show.
My great pleasure. Again, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a lot of fun.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Now, if people want to find more about you and your work, where can they go?
So the website is chrisweston.photography. Nice and easy. And there's a huge amount on the website about, not just about my background, but also for visitors to the site. There's a lot of free downloads on there, free to view videos and things like that. So, as well as the courses that I run and the photo safaris that I will start to run again when we can. There's a lot of information on there about my background and how I got into photography, but also that people can take from that and hopefully use in their own development. Which I'm passionate about. I think the more people out there taking pictures, and the better the industry is, and the more people out there taking good pictures, then the healthier the industry is. So, I'm happy to encourage anybody as best I can to become, the best photographer they can be. So there's a lot of information on the website for them to access.
Yeah, I would just like to second that as well, because we've spoken a lot and in depth, and I still feel like we have merely scratched the surface of the work you do. So on your website, we haven't even discussed the complete photography course. We haven't touched on your book, which we mentioned, Animals on the Edge, with Art Wolfe. But again, if people want to find that, all that information is there on your website. That was my conversation with the wonderful Chris Weston. Thank you ever so much to Chris for taking the time to come on the show. And as always, I hope you enjoyed listening to him as much as I enjoyed speaking with him. If you did and you like what we do, please leave a review. It takes less than 30 seconds on Apple Podcasts, but it really does help to secure world-class photographers who have very, very busy schedules. Thank you this week to MJC Smith, who said a thoroughly enjoyable listen, just started out on my photography journey and picked up some great hints, tips and inspiration. Already subscribed. MJC Smith, thank you very much indeed. If there's anything that sparked your interest during our conversation, visit thestandoutcompany.com/podcast, where you'll find links from the episode along with show notes. For now, thank you as always for joining us. I've been Matthew Walker, he has been Chris Weston, and you've been sensational. Until next time, take care.